So thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I'm very pleased to be here and excited to meet you all. And what a very cool event. You eat and drink and then hear from people who some people consider boring. I hope not to bore you. I'll do my best. I promise to do my best. And so anyway, as I said, it's a great honor to be here. I'm going to switch this way so I have a little light on my notes, more than notes. And to participate in this important and timely conversation, thank you, Jane, for the invitation, to Land and Sea, to the chef who's going to feed us, to the bartender who will get us sufficiently drunk. And to the organizers of this series, including the funders, who are all associated with Envisioning Justice and the Elective Studies series. Thank you especially to you who have come out, to new friends that I'm looking forward to meeting and having a nice conversation with, who might work alongside us to imagine, in fact, a different world. Perhaps one without police and jails and detention centers and prisons and electronic monitoring and criminal databases and unequal forms of justice to begin with. Perhaps at least we can envision one without the excesses of our current crime control apparatus. Perhaps together we might imagine our way out. This newly invigorated imagination may help us to find ways that the communities that we've all come to care about, whether that's through our practice, through our art practice, through our writing, through our thinking, through our research, through our presence, perhaps we might think about new ways that communities might indeed thrive. And so I'm going to start my remarks from a place and a position of care, which I think is a radical position because this is one that is far from apolitical. So from this position of care, we lead with our politics and start the conversation not without ethical commitments in mind, as some scholars pretend to do, but with the emancipatory potential of even the most disreputable among the lumpen proletariat in mind, those that are hard to organize, those who are less well educated, those who are not as bright and shiny as the objects that we prance out to get funding at the latest meeting or something like that. When I talk about this group, I'm thinking about the colonized, the racialized, the feared and loathed. In fact, the wretched who Fanon suggests are rife with political activism, even and especially when that potential for political activism is pregnant with violence and rife with conflict and contradiction. I start with them in mind and ask a question. What might we come to know about our systems of crime control if we were to encounter this wretched group in a state of freedom rather than in a state of control? That is, what might we make of the life that they find within and despite their social exclusion? In this way, I take inspiration from another scholar, Saidiya Hartman, who asks, what might we make of the life of a slave girl if we encountered her outside the traditional historical archive, which is by necessity a catalog of death and dismemberment? Put differently, Hartman wonders, how might we comprehend the life of a slave girl were we to consider her life outside the rape and murderous exploitation of plantation life? That is, how might we understand her life were we to encounter her in a state of freedom? I wonder about this. If we moved away from the constraints of our own archives, which lead us to attend to the formality of law and policy in the lives of the race and criminalized poor, in the lives of the dispossessed, those that we think are dangerous. That is to say that it seems to me that we only understand Black life specifically in this country and the lives of the poor and working class only as it can be imagined at the end of a police baton, or as the receptor of a bullet, or as rotting away in solitary confinement, or as one of many dismembered bodies floating in and through the haunts of a jail and prison yard. But what might we grasp were we to free ourselves from the shackles of our formality that only sees them at their worst place? Were we to concern ourselves less with how the carceral state controls and more with how and to what it contributes in the ways in which even the most oppressed among us work actively against it, to find and to make lives for themselves and their families? These kinds of questions would lead us to new discoveries. We would certainly learn about new forms of domination and new dynamic forms of resistance. We would even learn about new forms of resistance when that resistance is, quote, simply the resistance of survival. So this brings me back to the idea of this series as I understand it, which is to think across fields about the most pressing and urgent problems of our time. In this case, we are here to think together about how one might find justice given the current state of affairs, and more precisely, about what the experience of the poor, the underserved, the marginalized, the castigated, the racialized, indeed the wretched, what those experiences tell us about us, and about the state of our democracy, and about the health and well-being of our country, and about our impulse to punish, and about what punishment means in the lives of the people that we care about. So in the spirit of these talks, I must raise a few questions. The first is the most obvious. What if the problem of so-called criminals and the problems that so-called criminals face have little to do with criminal behavior? The second, a bit more probing. What if the primary issue was not about how they thought or felt or understood themselves? The third, what if it was a larger question, one about the extent of their political membership? What if it was a question about the ways in which they experience American democracy itself? What if the problem of mass incarceration at the end of the day was actually a problem of citizenship and not behavior? How might we theorize citizenship in this new carceral age if we were to approach the problem in this way? Where would we look to comprehend what I'm suggesting is a new carceral condition that has less to do with whether or not one commits a crime and has more to do with how we treat people? We must reimagine the problem if we're ever to change it, beginning with how we think about the subjects of crime control, the form that crime control takes, the work of crime control in our lives. So let's begin with the basics, how we think about it. We'll borrow insight from two of my heroes. The first, James Baldwin. The second, Nina Simone. We'll begin with Baldwin because I want to cheat. You can't lose with Baldwin. The year is 1965. It's October. Baldwin is famously debating William F. Buckley, a man called the, quote, father of American conservatism. This is at the storied Oxford Debate Society. The resolution for the debate, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. This is a very popular debate. It's on YouTube. You can watch the entire thing. Everyone should. Baldwin, of course, wins because Baldwin always wins. The resolve. Yes, of course the American dream is at the expense of the slave labor and of exploitation. And the question of whether or not the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro in 1965 is itself absurd. It is 1965. We have a Voting Rights Act and voter intimidation, a Jim Crow South and a Jane Crow North. Whiteness is sustained, he says, through black suffering. And in one of the most memorable lines in the debate, he reminds us of the black condition. This is what he says. He says, you're having a terrible time. You come to learn that the country to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. You're having a terrible time. Whoops, not yet. Oh, it is yet, yes. By the time you're 30, you've been through a certain kind of mill. And the worst part of this mill, Baldwin says, is not the policemen or the formal arms of the criminal justice system. It's the landlady, the landlord, the Western Union service clerk. It's the millions of details 24 hours out of each day that spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. Of course, Baldwin wins this debate. What could Buckley say? The second hero, Miss Simone. Again, I'm cheating. You can't lose. It's 1962. Nina Simone is recording the live version of Sinner Man at the Village Gate nightclub in New York City. The song's protagonist is the sinner man who seeks respite on Judgment Day. The song asks, "Oh, sinner man, where are you going to run to avoid judgment on that day?" He runs to the rock, to the river, and to the sea to ask for help, and eventually he runs to God, saying, "Please, God, hide me. Please help me, Lord." But the sinner man finds no respite. The river boils, the sea bleeds. The rock says to the sinner man, "I ain't going to hide you, guy." And God says, "Go to the devil." Sinner man, of course, is disappointed. He looks specifically at the rock in protest. He says, "What's the matter with you, rock? Can't you see I need you, rock? Lord, 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 on this day," the rock cries out, "I won't hide you." He says this 3 times and then says, "I ain't gonna hide you, God, on that day." So the song says, sinner man runs to the Lord. The Lord does not respond. Sinner man then says, "God, don't you see me praying? Can't you see I need you?" But God responds, "Where were you when you ought to have been praying?" He says, "Go to the devil." When sinner man arrives, the song says that the devil is, of course, waiting, and sinner man, sensing his fate, cries out for mercy. He says, "Power, power to the Lord," in effect, confessing his sins and submitting himself for judgment. In this parable, constructed from the traditions of the Southern Black Church, the sinner man knows that the devil will never be satisfied with his torment. That is, no amount of violence inflicted on the body of the accused will ever be enough. His cry of power, then, is not an act of worship, but an acknowledgement of a matter of fact. The state of the sinner man is in the hands of the devil. Simone's prophetic lyric, like Baldwin's always timely discourses on race and the human condition, better than most capture the social situation, I argue, of formerly incarcerated people today who find themselves at the mercy of others but rarely find mercy. They express what Fanon writes about as a Manichaean condition. This is a radical duality, a separation of the black from white, of spirit from flesh, that black people in the diaspora find themselves embodying, where they are viewed as the pathology, as dependence, as deficiency, as laziness, as danger, as amorality in the flesh, as all that is wrong in the world, and they are treated by their oppressors who wield the full force of police and the military and social policy, even particularly social welfare policy as such. For the formerly incarcerated living in the post-civil rights era, there are few, if any, open doors in the labor market, in housing, or even within their families. Their punishment is lifelong, beginning at the moment they admit legal guilt in court. And just like the sinner man's confession of power, the admission of legal guilt is brought about through rejection and exclusion, not fact-finding. Not through deep introspection, but through the power and force and weight of the crime control apparatus that comes down upon them and, unfortunately, on their families. The river boils, the sea bleeds, and the rock and God reject the sinner man, while social service agencies have waiting lists, affordable housing options are scarce, and employers, landlords, and their family members reject them at every turn. This is in part due to the proliferation of electronic background checks, the advent of what Sarah Lagerson has theorized as a kind of digital punishment, or what Susila Gurusamy has described as the carceral web, where Experian alerts don't come through our emails and text messages when there's a data breach, or when our information has been sold to Cambridge Analytica, but when a so-called sex offender moves a few miles away from our home, or when someone on a violent offender registry moves into our neighborhood. What's worse, their confession does not absolve them from sin, but it instead brands them, a digital scarlet letter marking the conventional citizen as criminal for life and sentencing them to punishment for a lifetime. Hence Simone's lyric, "The devil is waiting." But to more fully capture what life is like under these conditions, we must turn away from our impulse as scholars, as artists, as conscientious observers, from our focus on crime and punishment to focus on the violence apparent in the archive. Put differently, while we must acknowledge the formal mechanisms of exclusion, if we want to know what life is like for the wretched and to more fully theorize social life in the era of mass supervision, we must follow Hartman and try to encounter the wretched in a state of freedom, or at least in the moments of freedom that they manage to steal away under the suffocating realities and everyday violence emblematic of the carceral condition. That is, we must map the contours of their increasingly supervised life and note how social and formal legal controls constrain their lives. But if we want to better understand the world they inhabit, we must look at the informal mechanisms that shape their everyday lives. We must turn then away from prisons, the courts, the law, and the police if we are to see how laws and police practices get taken up outside the formal criminal justice system and inside their everyday lives. That is, we must move beyond and look outside the criminal justice system if we're ever to grasp its full scale. We must observe how the subjects of crime control make a life for themselves, despite all of it, if we ever want to fully understand the consequences of crime control itself in its life. But first, we have to map the contours. So I must say that we live in strange and marvelous times. Due to the success of books, bestsellers like The New Jim Crow, Becoming Miss Burden, which is a fantastic memoir that just came out, and just a number of important books, Locking Up Our Own, for example, by Tyrone Foreman, just won the Pulitzer Prize. John Legend goes to the Grammys and makes this beautiful Grammy Award acceptance speech, noting that there are more black Americans who are under correctional control than there were slaves in 1850, citing Michelle Alexander. For the first time, there's more attention on the questions of crime and justice and crime control and the use of the prison to address social problems than there ever has been in the history, in recent history at least. So much so that a sitting president comes out against mass incarceration, even visiting a federal penitentiary. And this, of course, is the world's most famous graph, right? This is the number of people who are currently incarcerated. And we see the graph just jump up after about 1972, where for 27 straight years, we had an increase in the currently incarcerated population in the United States. 27 straight years. That's unprecedented in the history of the Western world. And we know that there are 2.2 million people who are currently incarcerated. And we know about sort of the racial effects of all of this. Like I shouldn't say racial effects, I should say how this affects poor black and brown Americans. But if we think about black folks for a hot second, we know that black Americans are twice as likely to be arrested, 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, serve lengthier sentences when they are. They're more likely to serve mandatory minimum sentences, and their contact with the criminal justice system is disproportionate with their involvement in crime. In fact, recent studies have shown that even when we're looking at things like homicide rates among young folks, if you control for conditions that criminologists have identified as actually leading to crime, not single mothers, not just poverty, but things like whether or not one owns a home, things like level of education, etc. When you control for these factors, that the homicide rate between young black men hovers somewhere around 22 per 100,000 people. That's way egregious, terrible, awful. But looking at similarly segregated neighborhoods in segregated white communities like Columbus, Ohio, that tends to have them, and in poor regions throughout the country, Ohio, Michigan, etc. Scholars like Ruth Peterson and Lori Crevo find that the homicide rate among young white males is just about identical at 20 per 100,000 people. We've known this since 1999, y'all, but we don't talk about this. And of course, we know that 1 in 3 black American men will be incarcerated over some time in their life. The incarceration rate for black women is egregious in comparison to whites. Something to remember, though, is that black folks aren't the only ones affected by this. Of course, Hispanics and Latinos are. They're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. But there was a recent study by Hetty Lee and colleagues that found that 1 in 2 black women have a currently incarcerated family member, which is egregious. That's incredible. But 1 in 8 white women has a currently incarcerated family member. So just focusing on white women for a hot second, what does it mean for 1 in 8 of anybody in any population to have a loved one currently in jail or prison? This is incredible. And a new president is still talking about crime control in a very different way, but he's having this discussion. This is important. Over 2 million people, 2.4 at sort of the height of incarceration, million folks who are inhabiting a jail or a prison in any given year. This is very important, but I argue that our focus on prisons and the police leave a curious yet equally historic phenomena hidden in plain sight, what I call the rise of a supervised society. And that mass supervision has transformed the life worlds of the poor. And so we have to rethink and reimagine all of this. But to do that, we've got to put the prison in its place. 2.2 million currently incarcerated people in 2015 when I sort of pulled this statistic. But if we compare that to the number of people on probation and parole, we see that it's eclipsed. Switch your unit of analysis and think about the number of folks who transition through a jail in a given year instead of a point in time count, which looks at how many people in a given day. And we see that there are roughly 12 million people that pass through the nation's 3,000 jails. There are 3,000 jails. But even this figure is eclipsed by the number of folks with felony records. A recent estimate suggests that 19.6 million Americans have a felony conviction in the United States. This figure represents something like 1/3 of all living adult black American men have a felony record. And of course, there are nearly 80 million folks with criminal records in this country. This is a conservative estimate that came out in 2014 through the Bureau of Justice Statistics. If we take this together, we see that crime control, that punishment, that the criminal justice system isn't just a matter of who's going to prison or even just a matter of who's going to jail, but that people with criminal records are managed across multiple sites and by multiple actors. My argument is that community is where the action is because of this. And the prison, despite its place in the public discourse, is just a small slice of a vast carceral network. It is a comparatively small piece of this vast carceral network, representing something like 3% of all folks who are under some form of correctional supervision, if you think about the question more broadly. And so we have to account and rethink for the pervasive nature of this all. And we have to rethink the revolving door. A 2014 Bureau of Justice Statistics report shows that something like nearly 80% of all the folks who get released, they tracked 400,000 people who were released across 30 states. This is the largest cohort study of folks with criminal records or recidivism study to date, tracking 400,000 people across 30 states. There was an 80% recidivism rate after 5 years, meaning folks were rearrested. 80% of the people who were released from a jail or a prison between 2005 and 2010 were rearrested by 2010. But what's more striking to me is that 44% of this sample have been arrested 10 or more times. And the question that one must ask is, what does it mean to be arrested 10 times in 5 years? How do you keep a job? What does this mean for family life? How does one keep their commitments when they're constantly being, quote, spread out, like my guys talk about? So I'm interested in all this. I'm interested in how crime control shapes social life outside of the formal criminal justice system. That is, how it shapes life in the communities that are most affected by it. And so what I do is something called political ethnography, or what I talk about is political ethnography. And I do a political ethnography of prisoner reentry, or this process of return. And I've done research in Chicago, Detroit, and New York City in different ways, and I'm happy to talk about my methods. But why prisoner reentry? This is simple, because incarceration and reentry occur across multiple sites. They involve multiple actors that are mostly unaccounted for. And that reentry has itself transformed the nature of social life for the poor. You can't be arrested 10 times and everything be the same. There can't be 19 million folks with a felony conviction and city life look and feel the same. So we must move beyond the discussion of the prison and imprisonment and direct attention toward what scholars and I write about as mass supervision. So what does mass supervision look like? It looks like life under the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. This is a very famous website curated by the American Bar Association, a very important tool. And what it does is it tracks the number of laws, policies, and administrative sanctions in each state. And so across the United States, there are 48,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that hem in the lives of formerly incarcerated people, barring them from full participation in the political economy and culture. But the devil is always in the details. This is because all politics are local. In the state of Michigan, there's 789 unique laws. In New York State, there's 1,300 unique laws. But in Chicago, there are 1,463, outpacing both cases in my study. And these are laws, administrative sanctions, and regulations. This includes 583 that limit one's acquisition of business licenses and property rights. This is one's ability to, for example, be an entrepreneur. There are 556 that target employment. And some of these seem super arbitrary. For example, in the state of Illinois, one can't groom dogs if they have a felony record. 186 limit political and civic participation. This is which board someone with a record can sit on and how they can participate, whether or not they can hold public office, etc. 54 that constrain family and domestic rights. This is whether or not one can adopt a child or be in the home with a child. And this isn't just for folks who've been convicted of a sex crime, right? These are for people who are on any kind of registry, whether it's a gang registry, a violence registry, a sex offender registry, et cetera. And finally, 21 that limit acquisition to housing rights. And this is curious. This is curious. So we've recently become landlords. We bought a little building. We have tenants and all these sorts of things. And there's no state agency that tells us that we have to ask whether or not one has a criminal conviction. We don't have to ask that question. We're compelled to ask that question. We don't have to ask that question. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has 2 guidelines. You can't be on a sex offense registry, and you can't have been convicted of a crime involving methamphetamine production. 2 guidelines, but almost every public housing association in every major city has interpreted these 2 guidelines as nearly a broad-based ban on all folks with felony convictions, so much so that Chicago and New Orleans and New York City and these other large major cities are running pilot programs to see what happens if you let people with felony records stay on the premises. And what happens is they stay out of trouble. They have a home. They don't go back to, like, it's obvious what happens when you allow people to have housing. So what does this all mean? What does this look like? I'm an ethnographer. I haven't told you a single story from my field work. So I'd like to read a few vignettes to you, just 2, and I'd like to tell you and bring you into the life of a man I call Jimmy Caldwell. And so Jimmy is a short, affable African-American man in his mid-40s whom I met at the Detroit Reentry Center, a correctional facility that offers residential drug treatment and violence prevention services in the city of Detroit. Jimmy was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his late 20s and struggled for 2 decades with a crack and heroin addiction. A mental health technician took him off his medications during his prison intake, explaining that he had a drug problem and not a mental illness. Jimmy spent 8 years in a Michigan prison without access to drug treatment or counseling before paroling to the Detroit Reentry Center. After doing 6 of his 18 months of parole in a drug treatment program, he was released on the condition that he would report to his officer for weekly drug tests, regularly attend Narcotics Anonymous, complete a workforce development program, and get a job. Now that's a lot to ask, right? A generally happy man, Jimmy would break into sullen moods, crying during his meetings with his parole officer, and he'd often break into tears when we sat for our interviews. Fortunately, he had a perceptive parole officer who told him to get a psychiatric evaluation at a mental health clinic. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder quickly, again, right away, immediately put back on psychotropic medications, and was ordered to attend counseling sessions twice a month. This is a victory for the parole office. They did a great thing. They captured what was going on. So I met Jimmy at the Rosa Parks Transit Center, the city's main bus terminal, and shadowed him during his first appointment with workforce development. It was February of 2014, one of the coldest days of the year. Jimmy was underdressed. He wore a black Detroit Tigers jacket and a thin, worn skull cap. The address that he had to go report to was just under a mile from the terminal, so I said I would walk with him there. During our 20-minute walk, he was overly concerned with my level of comfort, cracking jokes while we walked to the Family Social Service Center, trying to put me at ease. He told me no less than 5 times that he appreciated, quote, spending time with a brother like you, and that he was glad to, quote, do something positive. When we got to the address, a gray stone monstrosity not far from Midtown, I understood in a deeper way why Jimmy went through all these motions to make sure that I was comfortable. The building was closed. The loose leaf printout taped to the door had addresses for a few hopefully open workforce development agencies, but the closest one was 9 full miles away. Ironically, that center was close to the property Joseph was helping to rehab. This was the same place that he slept at night. This was because he did off-the-books demolition work and cleaned newly rehabbed properties for a real estate developer that used to be his dope dealer. There was no phone number on the printout for the agency we needed to go to, and even if there was, Jimmy's phone had run out of minutes. He couldn't have called the number if there was one. The bus card that I gave him on our last interview had long since run out, and he was counting on a new bus card from me to get around for the week, and the $40 Visa gift card that I passed out as compensation for our interview to eat and refill his prepaid phone card. He also thought he could have gotten a bus card from the center if it was open, but it was not. If I wasn't with Joseph, he would have had to have walked 9 miles to the center or risk missing that appointment. Without the bus card, I handed out. He would have had to have walked miles to the parole office for his weekly drug tests. He would have had to walk miles to the AA meeting or counseling, or he would have had to to convince someone he knew with a car to give him a ride. He told me he could be sent back to prison for missing his appointment. His fears were far from unfounded. Not only did he know men who had been, quote, flopped, that means sent back to prison for a similar reason, nearly a quarter of all prison admissions the year before were for parole violations just like this. The price of violation is steep. Inmates who get, quote, flopped have to finish their sentences, and Joseph had 18 months left on his parole. Even if a parole officer doesn't think that the violation is serious enough to send him back to prison, in Detroit, they can detain you for up to 90 days at a facility that officers label the eye drop. They, quote, lay offenders down for 30 to 90 days. Joseph's careful work to ensure that I was comfortable paid off. We walked back to the bus depot where my car was parked. I gave him the appointment. I gave him a ride, largely because he needed to, but also because I was convinced that he was a nice guy in a bad situation. When we got to the Workforce Development Center, we learned that the training classes were full. He could not participate. There were simply no spaces in the class for him. He was told to put his name on a waiting list and come back next week in case a parolee failed to show up. They did not give out bus cards to people who were not yet in the program, and they could not guarantee him a spot in the next class. I chatted with the service provider together with Joseph about the opportunities available at the center and grabbed brochures on our way out the door, drove to Coney Island, which is the Detroit Giant chain near his work site, and temporarily to debrief on the day's activity. He thanked me profusely for the $7 lunch that I bought him, for the $40 gift card that I handed him, and for, quote, being there for him. There were so few places he could turn to for help that he had to cultivate my trust. Like Centerman, his life moved from one rejection to another. The mental health worker refused him psychiatric care. The social service agency had shut its doors. His only option was nearly impossible to get to without help. Without me, he may not have made his appointments with his parole officer. But even with my help, the agency that he reported to had no space and could not accommodate his needs. This all would have had to have been explained to his parole officer, who may or may not have believed him. And without his former dope dealer, he wouldn't even have had a place to stay. And by the way, homelessness is also a parole violation. Joseph, like the Centerman, is almost completely at the mercy of others, dependent on the kindness of strangers for food, clothes, and shelter, and on the mercy of the police, the courts, or the police officer, or the parole officer to stay out of jail or in prison. And in fact, he was dependent on me, a fairly gullible researcher, right, who would allow him in my car. And if I was telling you the truth, I wouldn't say that I gave him a ride because he was a very nice guy. If I was telling you the truth, I would tell you that I gave him a ride because I was cold and I didn't feel like getting on the bus with him. And so what do we have here? Mass supervision is not just about formality. Police, courts, I gotta stay within the black lines, police, courts, crime control agents, official agents of the state. But mass supervision offloads the responsibility and the power to punish on everyday people and everyday life, so that employers, landlords, criminal justice actors and agencies, licensing bodies and government officials, families, social service providers, almost everyone that people with criminal records come into contact with are endowed with an ordinate power over their lives. This is because helping puts others at risk. Changes in liability law since about 1980 mean that people like employers, landlords, folks who have insurance to do their work, even social service providers, are made responsible for the things that people in their care do, so that a grandmother can now be evicted if she houses a formerly incarcerated person. This changes the very nature of the relationship between that grandmother and her grandson. Good landlords don't allow people with records on their premises, right? Fatigue of parents, partners, and children sets in because it's hard to indefinitely care for someone who's locked out of the labor market. Employers, landlords, and social service agencies are made responsible for the action. We see this through lawsuits. We see this through reputation loss due to bad press. We see this through NIMBY, or not in my backyard, that happens to social service agencies. And what does this mean? This means social service agencies have to cream. They have to pick the most successful, the most likely success stories among the folks who show up. They have to not serve the lumpen proletariat, as it were. not the sex offender, not the violent offender. This means that we have to change drug laws for nonviolent drug offenders and not for violent offenders, which effectively means that if we released every nonviolent offender through our actions, we'd still have mass incarceration. But there are even higher stakes for formerly incarcerated people. Legal exclusions make them at once dependent on others for care, but the least desirable candidates to help. This is a largely unaccounted for vulnerability. If you think about it, what does this mean in their everyday life? This means an argument with a partner could equal a bout with street homelessness. This means if I have a record, I need my girlfriend. I need my wife. I don't mean I need my wife. My wife's here with me. I need my wife. I love you, woman. I need you, right? Like I need you. I'm not tripping. I'm like, I got to go home. But I don't need you, right? I need you because I love you. I don't love you because I need you. So the nature of relationships is fundamentally different now. And I'm not saying that everybody's a grifter, trying to, a womanizer, trying to figure it out. But there's a different kind of pressure on someone who needs their relationship for food, clothes, and shelter than there is for somebody who needs their relationship because they need companionship, say, and the things that we're taught are useful and good. A problem with a coworker could equal the loss of an already scarce work opportunity. This means I can't get in an argument at the day labor. I can't get in an argument at the day labor. I can't confront my boss. I can't confront my coworker because if I am a problem, I'm already viewed as a problem. And the employer has, quote, done me a favor when they hired me, no matter how much experience I've had. The landlord has, quote, done me a favor when they've leased an apartment to me despite my income or my credit score. A misunderstanding with a case manager could equal the loss of a job, food, transportation, drug treatment, counseling, or even time with one's family. This is a new catalog of disaster, to quote James Baldwin, that fundamentally alters the nature of social interaction. If we return to Joseph Caldwell for a hot second, without my notes, if we think about the three most important women in his life, this would be his mother, his sister, and his girlfriend who turned into his fiance. His mother wants to allow him a place to stay, wants to let him sleep on the couch. But her landlord says, you can't let him sleep on the couch, I'm going to put you out. So she can't let him sleep on the couch, and he doesn't want to ask her for any more favors because he's already strained that relationship. His sister won't support him. She hides toys at birthday parties because she doesn't trust him with the kids. And his partner, his girlfriend, his fiance, got together with him while he was in prison. This is particularly important, this relationship piece. It's something I want us to think about. So he had been with her. She met him in prison and stayed with him through his incarceration. When he got out, Jimmy said to me, he said, I want a younger, hot girl. That's what he said to me, right? Because he's like, I'm 45, she's 60, I'm not feeling this anymore, I'm through with that, right? But he stayed with her. He stayed with her because he had nowhere else to stay. He stayed with her because she offered him a bed and a place to sleep, right, where otherwise he would have to have slept in an abandoned or rehabbed house. And over time, he said to me that he wanted to marry her. And eventually he told me, I'm going to marry her because I owe her this relationship. In all three cases, he says that his relationships would be fundamentally different if he never had a criminal record. So if we look from above, we see mass incarceration. We see jail and prison expansion. We see voting rights. We see employment outcomes. We see recidivism. We see Trump and Jeff Sessions and all these problems at federal policy and local policy level. And we see things like the formal side of things. But if we look from below, we see mass supervision, a transformed social life, a new kind of poverty management. We see a new form indeed of political membership, a new kind of, in fact, citizenship with unique rights, restrictions, and responsibilities that only this group bears. This is not simply second-class citizenship, but it is an alternate form of citizenship. You can't treat your way out of this. You can't change someone's life to move them out of their political membership. It's a question of citizenship and not behavior. So what's the way forward? And I'm done. I think we have to advocate for law and policy change that reimagines crime control itself. I think policymakers have to start from the beginning and ask the question, what would it look like if I encountered the lumpen proletariat in a state of freedom? Put differently, what would life look like if we didn't have jails and prisons and police and courts and electronic monitoring, and this man, Jimmy, could move freely throughout the world? What would he need to thrive in that condition of freedom? He would need bridges to resources. He can't get a job on his own. He's locked out of the labor market. He needs somebody to go before him to help, just like we do. We have friends who tell us about friends who are hiring. He needs a friend to tell him about a friend who's hiring. We need to promote the intrinsic humanity of people in this situation, right? But we also have to shift perceptions and the way that we think about crime control itself. We have to move beyond the formal to think about informality. We have to push beyond recidivism and employment and focus on the conditions of human thriving. So I think that right now we live in a supervised society. I think that if we open the jail and prison doors today and we released everyone from them and they all walked out, we would still live in a supervised society. Over this 50 minutes, I've asked you a set of theoretical questions, and I've asked you to pay attention to new sites, new empirical sites, new places to collect data, new methods, new populations. But the real question before us is an ethical one. We live in a supervised society, but is that the society we want? Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.